Halfway through the list with number 25, Wilfredo Gomez versus Lupe Pintor, which took place on December 3rd, 1982 for the Ring and WBC Super Bantamweight Championships. This was a fight that was between two Hall of Famers, with Wilfredo Gomez in the red trunks and Lupe Pintor in the white trunks. Wilfredo Gomez gets off to an early lead with great pressure and just overall being more physical compared to the more relaxed and more willing to sit behind the jab version of Lupe Pintor that we get earlier in this fight. But Lupe Pintor starts to take over as Gomez starts to slow down in the middle of rounds. But Gomez gets a second wind in the seventh and just gets back to what he was doing. Lupe Pintor has to show underrated defense. I think that's one of the more underrated aspects of his entire style, that and his usage of the jab to deal with guys that were more akin to like forces of nature than him, guys that were physically stronger and faster. But he was able to stay in there. As Gomez starts to take a bit over, puts Lupe Pintor on the back foot, but Pintor manages to get a second wind of his own in the 12th round and hurt Gomez pretty badly. Gomez has to actually get dragged back to his corner at the end of the 12th. And in any traditional era, anything happening in the 90s and forward, that would just be the end of the fight. But this was not the 90s. This was the 80s, back when they still had 15 rounders. And those championship rounds, that 13th, 14th, 15th, that's all good stuff in this fight. I'm not going to spoil how this ends. It might go to the 15th. It might not. You just have to tell for yourself. Definitely a must watch. Before I go on to explain more about this fight, I'm just going to have you guys just look at this. Look at the setup on that left hook. It's crazy. This fight was probably one of the craziest fights that I've ever seen live, and it's probably my personal favorite out of the fights that I have on this list within the past 5 years, although it's not the highest ranked. I'm not going to spoil you guys on which fights are ranked higher, but for number 24, we have Angelo Leo versus Luis Alberto Lopez, which took place on August 10th, 2024 for the IBF Featherweight Championship. Remember how I said that earlier in the series, I said to go look at some of the guys at bantamweight in Japan as the best weight class currently in boxing? I think this is the second best weight class. These guys at featherweight, which Newa and Nui is probably going to be moving up to, are some absolute killers, man. Angelo Leo going into this fight, who's in the blue shorts, I wasn't really expecting much of. I had seen Luis Alberto Lopez before in the white and like Mexico colored themed shorts. I had seen him before, and I just knew he had a very weird style, but it just somehow always worked. I've seen him fight like 3 or 4 times before, and he just always figured out a way to win and just kind of overwhelm guys with that really weird hands down, chin up, just throwing punches when normal people wouldn't really throw punches. But Angelo Leo really took him apart throughout this fight. He just waited for the correct moment, just right on time. The timing on that left hook was crazy. And that it's a great KO finish to an overall great, interesting fight. Definitely a must watch, and something I'll show to casual fans that don't really know anything about boxing or say that boxing is boring, because every now and again you're going to get something insane like this that just comes out of nowhere. For number 23, we have Samsak versus Mehar Manshapur, which took place on March 18th, 2006 for the WBA Junior Featherweight Championship. This is one of those fights that is often highlighted as a bit of an underrated gem of sorts for people that are looking to get into the lower weight classes, and just highlighting very strange fighting styles. Samsak, who's in the black and red, going up against Manshapur, who is up in the more black with like the little bit of red at the bottom. This fight is very interesting. These are two very strange fighters that I wasn't really aware of until very recently. But I watched this fight and it was very good. I would think that it's a bit overrated because some people say it's like one of the best fights like ever across all weight classes, but it's still a great fight. Something definitely to check out. Samsak lands 2 knockdowns in the first round with like these weird uppercuts, but Manshapur just keeps coming back and just being very tough and awkward. He just gives him a hard time, but his lack of defensive abilities really come back to haunt him later in the fight, and Samsak eventually takes over just to win based off his superior skill. Definitely a fight to watch. Not a fight I would necessarily watch for film purposes or anything to copy yourself, but it's definitely something fun to look at. For number 22, we have Sho Komura versus Kosei Tanaka, which took place on September 24th, 2018 for the WBO Flyweight Championship. In this all-Japanese fight, we have 2 guys that came in with specific game plans that got interrupted by each other, and then they had to adapt and overcome throughout the fight. It's a very closely contested fight, a lot of skill shown. We have Kosei Tanaka, who's in the blue shorts with the green trim, coming out using his jab early versus the more straightforward going in version of Sho Kimura that we end up getting in this fight. But Sho Kimura's tendency and tenacity on trying to go forward the entire fight ends up getting him hurt a couple times early. Tanaka continues to lead the way, but Kimura starts adapting more with his body shots that you're seeing more as the fight goes on in these highlights. That bodywork starts paying off as he gets a better advantage in the pocket. We get a classic infighter versus outbox, or like a sniper versus hunter sort of scenario coming in. Kimura starts interrupting Tanaka more and more as he goes. This is an overall great fight. Tanaka starts switching a lot of angles on Kimura. So he would, instead of basically going forward and going back, trying to step out like in a linear way, he starts using a lot more lateral movement and getting his footwork going in order to escape and create his own, I guess, escape routes based off what Kimura was throwing at him. And it really helps him avoid a lot of the body shots as he keeps going. But Kimura adapts to that as well, following him through and starting to understand which angles he likes to take more. And starts landing some heavy shots late. This is overall great adjustments by both guys. Very high IQ fight. Definitely a must watch. All right, next on the list is the fight that inspired me to make this list. With number 21, we have Cornelius Boza Edwards versus Rafael Lemon, which took place on March 8th, 1981. Now, this fight is the first of a selection of fights from what I call the Ferocious Five, even though it's usually referred to as the Ferocious Four, but I'll explain a little bit more on that. This group of fighters is the fighters that took over that junior lightweight division after Alexis Arguello moved up in the early 80s. And this is both of these guys, Cornelius Boza Edwards in the white trunks, Rafael Lemon in the black trunks. You also have Bobby Chacon, Emmanuel Navarrete, and the other guy that I like to include, Chun Il Choi. And these fighters had literally some of the greatest fights of all time. All five of these men were involved in all-out brawls, wars, technical master classes, just everything in between, just great boxing from some of the most underrated fighters I've ever seen. But in this fight in particular, we have two southpaws battling each other. You have the more boxing focused approach of Boza Edwards versus the weird southpaw, just throwing a lot of hooks style that Rafael Lemon has that kind of makes him look like he doesn't know what he's doing. And then it just works because he's tough. But this starts as a bit more of a traditional boxing matches, hence why it's not as high as the other fights in this series, but it's definitely a great introduction to it. It's not insane to follow. You can follow it and tell what's going on without just being overwhelmed by all of it. But Boza Edwards actually knocks down Rafael Lemon in the 5th round, but Lemon, as always, is one of the toughest people to ever walk this planet. So he starts dragging Boza Edwards into these long exchanges and just starts overtaking him with body shots and just makes the fight a lot closer than it had any right to be. If you're just going from a technical aspect, Boza Edwards was just supposed to run over him, but Rafael Lemon never was one to just back down, and this just made for an overall great fight. All right, we are getting to the top 20, and as you can see, these fights from here on out are just the most insane, craziest, chaotic fights that have ever graced the sport of boxing. And this entry is Nona Kanadu versus Sun Kill Moon 1, which took place on January 20th, 1990 for the WBC Junior Bantamweight Championship. These guys had no regard for any safety of both themselves or their opponent. You have Sun Kill Moon, the Korean fighter in the red, versus Nana Kanadu fighting out of Africa in the white trunks. And these guys from the get-go just are insane. There's 3 knockdowns in the first round alone. They don't really have good chins, but that's what made this fight just fun and intense to watch. Just pure chaos from the get-go. Konadu starts to try to box a little bit more, but Sun Kill Moon refuses to accept anything but just going forward and throwing punches. So they continue their war in the middle rounds. They end up trading knockdowns again in those middle rounds. And it's just a chaotic war all the way to the end. These dudes are just insane. Definitely a must watch. If any fight so far on the list that I want a casual fan to watch with no knowledge of it going into, I would say probably this fight. It's just crazy. These guys just go all out. It's a straight up war. You don't really need to know much about these fighters going in. You'll basically find out everything you need to know about them, that these guys are absolute warriors by the time you're finished watching the fight. Just a pure spectacle of a fight. I would say the reason it's not necessarily higher, although top 20 out of 1,000 of fights is already very high. It's probably because it doesn't have like the drama or storylines that some of the stuff that I have later on the list does, or historical significance, but it's still a great overall fight to watch. Definitely a must watch for anybody looking for just some chaotic fun. Number 19 is Paul Bank versus Daniel Zaragoza 2, which took place on April 23rd, 1990 for the WBC Junior Featherweight Championship. This is your classic hunter versus sniper fight, with the hunter being Paul Bank in the black trunks and Daniel Zaragoza playing the part more of a sniping counterpuncher in the blue trunks. And the aggression that both of these guys has as this fight goes on is very impressive. A lot of great stamina shown by both of these men. Daniel Zaragoza was actually trained by the same guy that trained Ricardo Lopez, Nacho Beristain, and he also trained Oscar De La Hoya, Juan Manuel Marquez. Definitely one of the greater trainers of all time when it comes to boxing, and this was actually his first world champ, Daniel Zaragoza. So you see a bit of that style that you would come to know from Juan Manuel Marquez and Ricardo Lopez later down the line, but this is more of like a proto form here, and this is definitely a great fight. Paul Bank is just trying to come forward and overwhelm Daniel Zaragoza, and eventually does succeed, which is something that would be very interesting to see how Nacho Beristain would continue to adapt his style to deal with people that are going to do that in the future. So this is definitely a great fight, seeing how two different styles clash and how they kind of meld together to create art in a sense when it comes to boxing. Coming in at number 18, we have Kazuyoshi Kanazawa versus Ruben Olivares 2, which took place on October 25th, 1971 for the WBA, WBC, and Ring Magazine Bantamweight Championships. One of the older fights on this list showcases who a lot of people agree is the best bantamweight of all time. Myself, I think there are a lot of other great arguments, but this is the consensus, and that is Ruben Olivares in the white trunks. And he took on a great Japanese contender and Kanazawa in the purple trunks. And Kanazawa actually started off this fight with great movement and overall boxing, going up against one of the all-time greats and showing why he himself is probably one of the more underrated fighters on this list. Olivares lands a knockdown in the third, though, proving that his toughness and power, durability, just overall boxing mindset was a bit too much to overcome. But Kanazawa starts coming back, starts showing a lot of heart. He lands some bombs on Olivares, but Olivares is continually breaking him down to the body. Olivares showcases one of the best chins I've seen in a fight, just eating everything that Kanazawa throws at him, and that chin would actually hold up pretty well until later on in his career as he kept moving up. But against these smaller guys, he was just an absolute machine. Kanazawa continues to just land great shots on him up until around the 13th round, where that body shot game, the overall toughness, durability that I talked about just overwhelmed Kanazawa, and he got knocked down 3 times in the 14th round to a finish. This is a great fight between two all-time greats. Kanazawa might not be on the same pedestal that Ruben Olivares is put on, but this fight definitely proved that he can hang in there with some of the best of his era. At number 17, we have Kennedy McKinney versus Welcome Encito 1, which took place on December 2nd, 1992 for the IBF Junior Featherweight Championship. We have a battle between Kennedy McKinney in the red trunks and another guy with an awesome name, Welcome Encito, in the white trunks. And both of these guys went into this fight as highly touted, undefeated guys that were just kind of running through a lot of the competition, showing off great boxing, a new era of this junior featherweight division at the time. And Welcome Encito had very good success early on, and Kennedy McKinney, which actually became a trademark of his, started to come back and build up his confidence through the rounds. And that composure that he is able to maintain while being pushed back and hit around a lot is actually very impressive. And he lands a one-punch KO to get the finish over Welcome Encito and take his O. Definitely an overall great fight. Bit of a scrap early on, and it just not devolves into a war, but it gets a lot more aggressive as the fight goes and has a very memorable ending. Definitely a must-watch fight. We have arrived at the top 15, and this is where I would say there's another jump in the overall quality of the fights. Anything from here on out is absolutely some of the greatest presentation, drama, just the overall atmosphere of boxing at its greatest. This is what I would describe as the group of fights that I would recommend to anybody, regardless of what weight classes you're interested in. These are just some of the best of the sport. Number 15 is Joichiro Tatsuyoshi versus Yasue Yakushiji. Excuse me if I pronounced any of that wrong. Those names are kind of hard to say, but this fight is just awesome. Joichiro had this weird celebrity going into this, and he actually is probably one of my favorite fighters of all time, knowing the whole backstory of him and just how important he was to the Japanese boxing scene and the growth that it had during the 1990s. This fight was actually one of the first fights in Japan broadcast in HD, which is very interesting considering that it took place on December 4th, 1994. This was for the WC Bantamweight Championship. Joichiro was, as always, going to be the guy pressuring forward, and Yakushiji was more of the boxer in this, and he showed his overall skill to be better. Although the fight was very competitive, it was a fight of heart, a fighter versus a boxer, seeing if Joichiro could overcome these discrepancies that he had in skill with his overall heart, passion, and toughness. And though his future probably wasn't made any better by having these sort of fights, it was definitely great to watch and great to understand the heart of the sport. This is a very back and forth fight with a close decision. Definitely a must watch. Check it out if you haven't. We are back to the Ferocious Five with number 14, Chun Choi versus Renato Navarrete, which took place on January 16th, 1982 for the WBC Junior Lightweight Championship. This is what I would consider probably the most underrated fight out of that series of great fights that happened between these five guys in the early 80s. This is a southpaw versus orthodox matchup. Renato Navarrete in the yellow versus Chun Choi in the blue and white. Chun Choi was known for his pressuring game, and Navarrete actually showed very decent defense, which was actually surprising. In other previous fights that I've seen of his, he was known as a bit more of like a southpaw brawler than a great boxer, but his defense was on point early in this fight, undergoing the storm that Chun Choi unleashed on him. But he gets caught in the third and hurt a couple times before he actually is able to start getting that left straight to land, and that is really what gets him going. But Chun Choi comes back and knocks Navarrete down with some straight shots in the fifth. Navarrete starts to pull himself together in the middle rounds, and we're just in an all-out great fight at this point. Navarrete starts going to the body more. He lands that patented lead hook that he has out of that southpaw stance. It just has excellent adjustments throughout the fight. Definitely a very closely contested fight and a great showcase of these guys. Number 13 is Alfonso Zamora versus Carlos Zarate, which took place on April 23rd, 1977. This fight had a lot of hype going into it, especially for lower weight fights at bantamweight going into the 1970s. This is probably as hyped as a fight would get. Carlos Zarate, the taller man in the red trunks with the white stripe, going up against Alfonso Zamora in the solid red trunks. And even though these guys were basically wearing the same clothes, they had about a 70 and something and 0 record going into this, about like 85% knockout percentage between the two of them. It was just a battle between two undefeated KO artists. A fan interferes randomly in the fight. Carlos Zarate is just a machine at this time. He just kind of walks through Zamora, but it's a firefight throughout. Even though it's a bit one-sided and Zarate is obviously the one coming out in front in most of these exchanges, it's very competitive in other ways in just how tough Zamora is, and he just doesn't really give up. He kind of just accepts that it's either he's going to find the perfect punch or he's going to get knocked out. And even though he does get finished, this is an amazing firefight. Definitely a quick sprint. I would say this is might be a little bit better than Hagler versus Hearns, just for the raw intensity of it. The atmosphere of it was still crazy. The fans were just rabid at this. You could hear them through like the really low quality mics that they had recorded in the 70s. And this is just an overall fan favorite fight. I definitely agree with this being one of the most underrated fights in boxing history. This is definitely something I would recommend anybody to check out. It's nothing too long either. It's just fun and a great fight. Number 12 is Junko Chain versus Katsuyo Tokishiki, which took place on August 18th, 1984 for the WBC Junior Flyweight Championship. Junko Chain, along with Myung-Woo Ya, who you saw earlier on the list, are a duo of guys from South Korea that basically ran these lower weight classes, minimum weight and junior flyweight throughout the early 80s. And even though they didn't fight, it was definitely a golden era for that country. Lots of great fights happened between these guys and their opponents. Junku Chain in this fight in the blue trunks is just in an all-out war with Tokashiki in the white trunks with the black trim. And these guys maybe throw the second most amount of punches I've seen in a fight. Just it's insane the amount of punches these guys are able to get out in this fight that only lasts about 9 rounds, but has more output than I say 99% of even old school 15-round fights. Tokashiki, even though he gets knocked down early, is able to like settle in a bit more and weather the storm that Junku Chain is usually able to overtake most of these other guys with, but he eventually gets overwhelmed. But through the process, it's just constant action. He lands some great shots of his own, but Junku Chain around this point of time was just more of a force of nature than anything else. The guy was just running through people. And even though Tokashiki was able to withstand more than most people, it was still a bit too much. Number 11 is Michael Conlan versus Lee Wood, which took place on March 12, 2022 for the WBA Featherweight Championship. This fight was an unexpected masterclass in emotional stakes, skill, and just overall drama. Michael Conlan, who was expected to come in and prove that his superior amateur background was just a bit too much for Lee Wood, landed the early knockdown early on. Lee Wood in the white trunks just surprisingly was able to gather himself together and slowly come back throughout the rest of the fight. This fight is a throwback. It reminded me a lot of those crazy fights that we had in the 1980s when both guys just kind of accept the dangers of what they're actually doing and are just going all out without any regard for their safety. That is probably not the greatest way to fight, but it definitely makes things entertaining. And the ending of this fight, I'm not going to spoil, but it's definitely a must watch. Probably my favorite ending out of any fight on this list.